Hey, I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk, and I am with CBRE's Jerry Inguagiato, and we're in Silicon Valley, and we're talking about the data center industry. Next.
Hey, I'm David Liggett with Data Center Hawk. Focused on cloud and colocation, data center industry trends, the dynamic market.
I'm sitting in Silicon Valley with the one, the only Jerry Inguagiato. Jerry's CBRE with CBRE's Data Center Solutions Group, Senior Vice President there. Jerry, thanks for hosting us today.
Welcome to town, David. Great to have you. Thank you.
You bet. Because we're sitting in this picturesque spot right here in downtown San Jose, why don't you give everyone just an understanding of where we are from a geographic perspective, and then I want to get into your background, how you got into the data center industry, which is actually really interesting, and those that are watching will find it interesting, and we'll go from there. But tell us about where we are in relation to, San Francisco, the coast, et cetera.
So we figured let's have this interview up on our sky deck of the roof. It's a great vista, gives everyone a sense of our proximity to the geography of the valley.
Sure.
We physically sit in Santa Clara County. We're about 40 miles south of San Francisco.
Okay.
You can see our mountain range just over our shoulders. We physically sit, as the crow flies, about 26 miles from the Pacific Ocean. Some of the biggest waves in the world are ridden literally right over that mountain range.
Yeah.
We sit 50 miles from the first tee at Pebble Beach.
Okay.
We sit about 70 miles away from Napa Valley.
Yeah.
We sit about 200 miles away from some of the best skiing in the world at Lake Tahoe.
Awesome.
So very diverse, very dynamic, micro geography here.
Sure. So, and you've been here for a long time. So, my background, my history, I was at CBRE for a while. That's how we first crossed paths 10 to 15 years ago. When we first met, I was always really impressed by how you were deep into the data center industry even then. And it wasn't really until maybe 04, 05, 06, 07 that the industry really picked up steam to the point where it was really becoming a real estate asset class that the commercial real estate world was really tracking well. And I think you were doing that far before the traditional market was. But talk about just your background. How did you end up focused on the general real estate market, but also the data center space specifically?
Yeah, I'll share that story. So I studied industrial technology in college and came out, my first job out of school, I was an application engineer.
Okay.
And that's what brought me to the West Coast. I did 2 different startup stints as an engineer and got myself into sales engineering, so really problem solving, but from a very technical level. I got a taste of the culture, of the spirit of this community in the Silicon Valley, and it really was exciting. What I wanted to do and what I wanted to parlay was my problem solving from an engineering standpoint. I wanted to parlay that into finance and real estate.
Sure.
That's what got me into the business.
Interesting.
That was back in 1996.
Okay.
So in and about that time, in 1996, our government deregulated the telecommunication business.
Sure.
They passed the Telecom Act of 1996. Fundamentally, what that did was it opened up the marketplace. So you had competitive local exchange carriers that were able to come into markets, compete, offer services. So with that, we saw a breed of new requirements coming through the office. Different levels of engineering requirements. A typical requirement back in those days might be an office user, might be an industrial user who had maybe 3 or 4 specific drivers for a requirement. With these CLEC telecommunication requirements coming through the market, much more rigorous standards, higher performance requirements for facilities. We saw an opportunity in our desk in the office, and we said, we think there's an opportunity. These folks need more help than what's offered in the marketplace. And that was really our inspiration for creating our data center practice, which was founded in and around 1997. We took our primary 12 markets in the US and we co-founded our data center practice. To this day, it's the longest running advisory practice in the country. We're real proud of that.
Yeah, you bet. And talk about, being in Silicon Valley. This is one of the largest data center markets in the world. You've been here from, really the beginning of what has gone on over the last 20 years.
Yes.
Talk to us about why data center users like to be here. I mean, what draws them here, and then how has the market grown over the last 20 years?
Yeah, so taking a step back, what's the underlying dynamic driving data center demand? That's the question. And take a step back and just take a look at the general economy. Take a look at the ecosystem here. So we've got roughly 1.8 million people that live in the Silicon Valley, roughly 1 million people employed with an under 3% unemployment rate. So very high level of jobs with low unemployment, people that are paid really, really well. 50% of the patents that were issued last year in the state of California were issued here in the Silicon Valley. 50% of all venture capital that's deployed across the greater US is deployed here in the Silicon Valley. So you have this catalyst of innovation, of invention, of taking the next step in progression with technology. It's happening here. We're innovating here. We're leading that in the Valley. And so that fundamentally is driving this data center demand that you're talking about, this super compute, this super capacity for storage. It's occurring here. Those are the drivers. And like we spoke about, it's such an exciting place to live, this convergence of lifestyle, of education, of finance, of tech, all that's converging here. And I think fundamentally, that's what's driving this market. So it's really, this is a market, it's a data center market by default.
Yeah, so where did the growth first begin? When you think about, and maybe too, you could define when you say Silicon Valley, because maybe different people have different definitions for what that is. Some people probably think it's a show, but from your perspective, define kind of the market and where did the data center development begin 20 years ago? What was it like then?
Yeah, so a requirement 20 years ago was very different than it is today in terms of a data center development. Again, it was primarily driven 20 years ago through the telcos, bringing infrastructure, network infrastructure to the marketplace, and then as an adjunct to that, supplying co-location services. And it was done for the first time really on a retail, large-scale basis. So there were a handful of players that were coming into the market, bringing in supply. The majority of them were retrofitting existing industrial properties. There were a handful that had the vision and more importantly had the capital to self-develop, acquire land, entitle, and construct. Generally these requirements though were retrofit a flex building. It's very different than what we've seen occur over the years.
Yeah, and talk about how the developments have changed, and we spoke some about this, and I think it speaks to the greater market growth and some of the trends that are taking place here outside of the data center space that are creating some interesting dynamics for the data center market here to grow. But if you think about what it was 20 years ago to what it is today, talk about the developments that are here in Silicon Valley and how they're different than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, so 20 years ago we were looking at very low density FARs, floor area ratios, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50%. So every square foot of land, half that square foot would be developed roughly for a building structure. Today we're seeing, just due to the constrained dynamics we have in the marketplace, the competition for land, land always finds its highest and best use. And like we spoke about with these very competitive tech firms that are in the area, they're bringing in top level talent, they're competing for the land just like our data center community is. And so what we're seeing are a major trend today are very dense vertical developments that are really at the forefront of development. We're seeing 4-story, 2.0 FAR construction that's new to the marketplace.
Yeah, it's very different, and I'd say out here is one of the first places that you really saw the adoption of 2 to 3-story data center facilities. Now we're starting to see that in other places as well. Northern Virginia, they're actually doing some in Dallas, Chicago. But I think Silicon Valley is one of the areas where that really started for the reasons that you mentioned. One of the other things we've seen here in the last couple of years is an uptick in the capacity that's under construction. And so for those that are watching, we at Data Center Hawk CBRE pay close attention to the capital that's being invested in the facilities that are being built, how they're being built, and it's always interesting to watch how much is coming to the market. But talk about why there's been an increase in developers buying land or trying to buy land and bringing supply to the market here.
Yeah, so we've demonstrated over the years, this is a market that's a proven absorption market. If you build it, you will see absorption. We're going to see vacancies this coming year in 2020. Right now they're coming in about 7%, David. We're going to see those vacancy rates decrease further due to the pipeline of construction and absorption that we've seen. We've seen tremendous pre-lease this year. And the dynamic in our market is it's about a 2 to 3 year process to bring new product to market.
Sure.
Yeah. And so...
and what contributes to that timeline? Because there's other markets where you'll hear the data center operator community talk about how quickly they can deliver supply to the market. So here, it's a bit different. Tell us why it is that 2 to 3 year window.
Yeah, when the property is purchased and the land use, you go through an entitlement process to redevelop the land, increase density, confirm use, and ultimately get government approvals to do this development. It's all done in a public forum. And with public input. And in our community, that takes time to work itself out. There are often circumstances where there's some give and take between the community and the developer that you can't necessarily underwrite or anticipate. And so optimistically, people will tell you, to get proper entitlements to build 6 to 9 months. I think a bit more realistic time frame is a year, and it can take longer. We're seeing that possibly take up to a year and a half to get those rights, those entitlement rights, to begin to construct.
So if you follow Data Center Hawk content, one of the things that we've talked a lot about over the last 12 months has been the hyperscale growth and how it's impacted the overall data center market. One of the really interesting things about that trend is a lot of those companies are headquartered actually right out here, just as far as their company in general. How do you see that part of the market impacting the Valley? I mean, how has those bigger companies and what they've done impacted?
Yeah, that's been one of the biggest changes we've seen in the market. When you track demand in the market, the profile of that demand, who's taking down this capacity. When you compare and contrast, we were having this discussion about comparing 20 years ago to today. One of the major factors is that the size of the transaction has increased significantly, and the number of players has decreased. Where if you're looking at absorption records from 20 years ago, we were tracking 40, 50 different players in the market, all independently looking to acquire their own facility, spend their own CapEx, manage their own construction project, all independent of each other. Today we're seeing the inverse of that. And I think case in point is if you look at absorption for 2019, we're on pace to do our third biggest year in the last 23 years. So it's going to be a big, successful year. About 95% of the absorption is with one player. So it's a very different profile, and I think it's an opportunity. And it's also a challenge for our community to forecast how to bring supply to market, given those changes.
And you bring up a really good point about the forecasting and as it relates to capital. And that's really one of the challenges that all these companies are trying to figure out is how much money do we put out there from a speculative perspective in order to attract demand. Let's switch gears to the user side of things, the end user. So, you mentioned that there's a very large component of the absorption that will take place here that's large company related, hyperscale related. But there also are other companies that are here that have requirements, and we certainly have seen some of the dynamics of those requirements change over the last 5-10 years. Talk about just the user today, what I'll call the enterprise user, both from and maybe I would define that as the size, the 1 to 2 megawatt, 500 kW range, and that's a size of requirement for those that aren't aware, and then just also what their internal business challenges are that are pushing them to do what it is they're doing from an infrastructure standpoint. What are those companies seeking today? Yeah,
so great question on the demand side, and we see a couple of profiles in the market today. I would characterize the Valley as a unique environment in that we're heavy analytics, heavy engineering, and so that type of a personality wants to, I think, inherently control and have some ownership in that infrastructure and in those facilities and operations. They want to have that. And so we still, to this day, we've got a number of clients we're working with right now that they want on-prem operations. Not necessarily at the headquarters, it can be remotely within, a reasonable radius of the headquarters, but they want to design, they want to own that operation. They do want to outsource the CapEx piece of the transaction, though.
Okay.
They're still very interested in taking advantage of the models that we're seeing today, which fundamentally has been a shift in capital. They still want to outsource that, but they want to control the operation and the environment. And I think there's an element of they don't necessarily need all of the services that are being offered in the market, and so why would you want to pay for that? We can, again, I think with that analytical personality, they want to control where they need support, where they don't necessarily need support.
Sure.
And so we still see a very active community that wants to lease a very traditional industrial building, have it converted for their needs.
Yeah. So being in Silicon Valley, how do you see both data center users and developers handle the seismic risk? What do they do to make sure that they're as risk-free as possible related to that?
Yeah, I think it's inherent in our community. We know it's part of the culture here, and it's designed, these facilities are built to withstand those types of seismic activities. It really is just part of our culture. It's just part of the offering. Where you'll see, again, back to this type of user that wants to kind of have an on-prem type of solution, they may feel, there are standards. They may feel that maybe they could be on a lower range of a healthy standard. If you compare and contrast that to a developer that's got an open marketplace, they've got to be able to satisfy a wider range of application, and so they'll be on the higher range of that standard. The other type of user, we were talking about kind of the heavy analytical, engineering-based type of firm. The other type of clients we do have out here are very much like our firm, service-based, advisory-based type of business. And we're seeing kind of across the board with those players, we are seeing a shift to a cloud-based practice.
Interesting.
And so very strong shift right now. And this has been in building over the years. Not a new trend, but certainly a trend that's building momentum. That shift, David, is clearly they are not looking for on-prem. They are absolutely looking to outsource, and it tends to be a hybrid solution. It's not a complete cloud solution off-prem. It's some combination of a relationship where they can manage that footprint. They can take control, own that infrastructure, their compute. They can own that, manage it, but it's all outsourced. That CapEx, the OpEx, all of that operation is outsourced. Some of that footprint is deployed to the cloud. But I would say there's a huge contingent of the service players that are going to that strategy. If they own any of their infrastructure, own any of their data center real estate, they're looking to monetize and completely divest themselves of those assets. And that's a trend that we will continue to see. And really the question becomes, what's the adaptive reuse for those assets? Where are you taking this property? What's the value in the property? And often, many cases, there's tremendous upside if these properties are located in the valley.
Why is that? Tell us why.
Yeah, so I'll share just a quick story, kind of anecdotally on values. So my wife and I bought our first home 23 years ago. It was a little starter home in Palo Alto, and we scraped everything, all of our savings. We bought this home, 2-bedroom, 1-bath. It was about a $350,000 home. If you fast forward to today, that same home will cost you $2.5 to $3 million. So that starter home today, that's $2.5 to $3 million. 20 years ago was obtainable. Today is a challenge. And so again, the competition for land, oftentimes with some of these locations, we're seeing industrial locations. For example, the city of San Jose, the city we're sitting in, over the last decade, the last 10 years, has rezoned 16 million square feet of industrial commercial properties to residential. So we're seeing alternative uses that are by default becoming higher and better uses that potentially are exits for some of these obsolete data centers. The flip side is it's also adding additional constraints to the marketplace, adding again more competition for that industrial base. data centers typically don't exist, and we're sitting in front of a beautiful Class A multifamily building. We're sitting in a beautiful Class A office building.
Sure.
Data centers don't exist in those kind of environments. They're typically housed in heavy industrial neighborhoods, heavy industrial locations that have adjacency to the central business districts. Fundamentally, in Northern California, our industrial markets, over the aggregate entire marketplace, we're talking hundreds of millions of square feet of industrial product, are running 2% vacancies. And they've been running historically low vacancies for years now. Because again, we keep chiseling away at that industrial base to satisfy our discrepancy with this housing crisis that we find ourselves in. That's going to be a challenge for our business, is that next wave of innovation and expansion for the business. Where are we placing these data centers? And I think ultimately is going to put more pressure on these governments to allow us to go denser with the footprints.
What's the infrastructure like here from both a power and connectivity standpoint, and how is the market kind of viewing renewable energy? How does?
I think sustainability, renewable is at the forefront of everyone in the community. It's all about being responsible and paving the way for the next generation. The challenge for us is, how do you do it in a responsible manner that's accretive to the business? And we're seeing it. We're seeing leadership. We're certainly in talking it through. And there are folks that are in the business that are innovating. I think each version, each next iteration of a development, you see the innovation occurring.
So, Jerry, we certainly have seen the fundamentals change over the last 3 to 5 years in a number of different ways. But talk about, even probably to like some investors that are watching, or to the data center operator community that's watching, how are you seeing the changes in the way that data center operators are bringing supply online, as well as investment trends, changes with percentages of yields and some of the rental rates and things like that are happening in the market today?
So a couple things to keep in mind in the Silicon Valley. People want to be here. They want to be part of the movement that's occurring here. There's tremendous excitement, tremendous opportunity. They want to be a part of it. So consequently, we've seen a number of new players come to market. We think it's a great thing. A number of new faces that are talking about some really exciting new projects that we need. We need this capacity to make our economy run. That's a fact. We're excited about that. What we're excited about also is that these new suppliers really seem to be showing discipline in terms of bringing supply to market. So in the past 12 months, we've seen 5 major new announcements that are in early planning stages right now to bring supply to market. Again, 7%, probably going lower this year. We have no new construction that's going to hit the market next year. It's not going to happen. Vacancies going down. We need supply. We've got one project that the developer's talking about potentially will be the largest data center in the state of California. So the scale is tremendous. We need that scale. But what I'm really impressed about is, you talked about innovation. What I'm impressed about is these groups are now innovating, trying to manage their own capital stack. They're trying to manage, they don't have to build all this capacity. And they've figured out ways to develop just-in-time inventories where they've compressed the construction time periods. So the shell, the core structure will be completed, but the actual delivery of the infrastructure will be dripped in as the demand requires it. And they've figured out ways to do it well within a typical transaction time frame. So they can manage it. We just don't see a situation, we think, where there's going to be a tremendous overbuild. We think we'll continue to be a balanced market.
It really feels like that, and especially to your point on the discipline side of things. I think it's one of the biggest things that, I think there's always a perception when people hear about the big project, if they don't really understand maybe the way some of the either the data center operators actually deploy capital, when they deploy it, and how much. It's very easy to get maybe off kilter in how you think about what is actually being delivered, where they certainly have got that down to a science. Well, tell us about, you've been in this industry for 25 years now.
Right.
What gets you excited about the future?
I think the business has really become institutionalized. When you look at when this business, where it's gone, there's an index, clearly tracking this business today. It's exciting to be a part of it. It's an exciting place to be. What we see is every day we're picking up the phone, we're educating someone new about a new source of capital,
Sure.
about the opportunity, and people really want to be part of what's happening. So that's a really exciting place to be. I think seeing the innovation, seeing that next opportunity to come along and being at the forefront of that is a really satisfying place to do business and to help people solve problems. I think that's what really gets us excited.
Yeah, well, Jerry Inguagiato, thank you for hosting us here again, Silicon Valley. If you want to learn more just about Jerry's practice and what they're doing, you can obviously reach out to him. We'll have his contact information in our show notes. But really, seriously, thank you. This is it's always fun for me to get to sit down with people I've known for a long time, and we've known each other a long time. So congrats on what you're doing out here, and look forward to the future.
Love it, David. Thank you.
Thanks, you bet.
Yeah, appreciate it.